Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Podcast. You're joined today by me and Nasif and a special guest for the first time, Jason Szeftel.
Hey guys, how you doing? Good to be here.
Okay, so Jason is an expert in China and geopolitics in general. He has his own YouTube channel and his own podcast. Do you want to say what they are?
Yeah, sure. So I started a podcast when the COVID pandemic broke out. I just finished the first draft of a book on China, its history, kind of everything about that country. And then a global pandemic had just popped out of that country, and I figured it was a good time to share some of this information before it got published in a book. And so I made this podcast. It's really great. Anyone interested in geopolitics, China, economics, modern world would really enjoy it. A lot of cool stuff. I recently did a 5-part series called Tales of the Communist Empire. It's about what does internal Chinese politics look like? What does the Communist Party do? How does it function? Where did it come from? How does it actually look from the inside? Really interesting because for most people, it's just a giant monolithic red faceless Borg, which may be true, maybe not, but it is helpful to have that perspective. And the most recent episode is called The Red Emperor. It's about how does Chinese politics happen? What does it actually look like if you look at the long historical perspective? Was Mao more like present Chinese leaders or past Chinese leaders, or any of them really like Western leaders? Were they ever really trending towards something that we would consider modern politics? What does modern politics even mean? All those sorts of questions. And then that's been really great, but I'm moving more and more things to YouTube to give people visuals, to give people longer context, to do live streams where I can really break down issues, give people more information. So check that out. Just look up Jason Szeftel. You'll find a website, you'll find a podcast, you'll find dozens of interviews, you'll find the YouTube channel as well.
Great. And as we do every single week, we're going to start off with a quiz, but this time it's for you, Jason. So you have 15 seconds to name as many Chinese politicians as you can. So from 3, 2, 1, go.
All right. Well, let's start with Xi Jinping, the big dog. Let's go for some old prime ministers too. Presidents. We'll do Wen Jiabao. We'll do Hu Jintao. We'll do actually Wen Jiabao. I don't even know where that one came from, but obviously we'll do Mao. We'll do Deng. We can do Jiang. We can do Bo Xilai. That's a fun one. We can do, who else has been prominent recently? Chen, the guy who's been helping Xi with potentially has a role in the future if the third term doesn't happen, but likely we're getting the third term. So that's probably 15 seconds.
Yeah. So in total, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in total. Well done.
There we go.
Yeah. So let's crack on with the show. So the first question to you is, how did you develop your interest in China and geopolitics?
Sure. So I've been interested in China really as long as I can remember. It was just a sort of natural youth curiosity. Really interested in the culture, language, people, architecture, kind of everything about the place. And then after 9/11, I got more interested in the country. I felt like there was a looming conflict potentially between the US and China. The US was going through all these Middle Eastern misadventures, what was happening. I was very interested and curious. That kind of deepened my interest in the country. I was sort of in this place where the nation that I was a part of, American, it was sort of seemed like it was heading towards a conflict with the nation I was probably most captivated by, just in my imagination. So that was good. I had actually a Chinese person basically throughout my childhood, kind of moving in and out of my parents' home for various reasons. So I had early exposure to China, Chinese people, Chinese culture. And then about 12 years ago, I first learned the Chinese language. I ended up getting a scholarship to study in China, went there, lived there, went all around the country, et cetera, et cetera. And then, yeah, I mean, it's been a long time, been a wild ride, but really goes back as far as I can remember. And the real key to making it make sense is a framework that probably could best be called geopolitics, which is just about how place really matters. And when we really take where things are seriously or where they've been, it really helps to ground us and get us a simple yet very expansive vision of why things happen, of why politics and economics plays out the way it does.
What would you say are the biggest differences between China and the Western world? Maybe the ones that we, as citizens of the West, don't often see.
Sure. I would say that the biggest myth that I think people should always keep in mind whenever you hear China, talk about China, see articles or anything about China is that the biggest myth, and there's a lot, there's like probably 10 myths, but I'll just do the main one that helps to break it down, is that there's one China. The idea that there's one China is totally, totally false, right? And this is, of course, hard to believe when you see a big, you see a big country on the map. It's usually bright red, looks massive and monolithic, and that isn't really the case. And we start to understand this when we see Taiwan. We're like, oh, well, there's a little baby China off the coast there, but it's actually deeper than that. If you break down China into its provinces, right, to start, first of all, these provinces, most of them are political constructs. They don't, some of them map onto older patterns and cultures and people's groups within China, but a lot of them are specifically constructed to actually, kind of like the Soviet Union did back in the day, they specifically created all these stands to group ethnic groups that don't belong together to make them easier to rule and conquer. Similar, not as intense, but similar things are happening in China. And so there's this breakdown. If we were actually look at China on a map, we could show how the southern coast almost has nothing to do with northern China. There's this giant mountain range that has prevented real integration with the rest of the mainland forever. Basically, these people, they have different languages, different ethnic groups, different everything, different cultural patterns, different economic systems. It's been like that way forever. And so a great example is always Hong Kong. There's basically a string of city states, island city states, coastal city states that stretch from Shanghai all the way down to Hong Kong or the Pearl River Delta. That is the best way to think about it. And there's literally, if you were to look on, we were to look at the infrastructure, there's very limited agricultural infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and other, even a lot of transportation stuff, although they've done some work with that, connecting this part of China to that northern element. And so this is part of it, right? So once you realize that there's not one China, we could say, well, what Chinas are there? How many are there? Where do they come from? Why are they different? How integrated are they? And that is where the real interesting questions that help us understand China, that's how they come about.
I think you touched on a great point there, that there's not just one type of China. I think, and this happens all over the world, many people think there's only one type of Africa, one type of Russia, one type of the Middle East, and it's just simply not the case, and it will never be the case. And you just briefly talked about there, you mentioned Hong Kong. What do you think of the situation that's going on over there at the moment?
Yeah, so Hong Kong is being flattened, right? So, and I don't mean that in terms of like physical infrastructure, but Hong Kong, the goal of the Communist Party is to flatten Hong Kong and to make it indistinguishable from the rest of the Pearl River Delta regions, and more broadly, that string of potentially separatist city-states that all live on the Chinese southern coast. Because Hong Kong is extremely dangerous to the Communist Party. It was both extremely useful and extremely dangerous. And for a long time, the balance was on the utility, because what Hong Kong did is it served as a financial interface between Hong Kong, I mean, between the West and mainland China. And it allowed, especially in the last 40 years, it was what enabled many of the financial flows that enabled the investment-led development we saw throughout China. It had a very key role to play in this. But in the last 10 years in particular, things have really changed. The economic system in China has substantially shifted. The relationship with the rest of the world has shifted, and the balance overall of what Hong Kong can provide versus the threat it poses. Because Hong Kong is a place that grew wealthy independent of the Communist Party. It is a place that shows, particularly southern China, how the world could be, how you can still be wealthy without being fully integrated into the Chinese system. And that is extremely dangerous. Obviously, Taiwan does something similar at an even larger scale. But this is a pattern of China's history that's repeated multiple times. And I think also, just really quick, it's good to realize that this isn't a question of like there being many Chinas in terms of a abstract grouping, right? I mean, like these pieces of China war against each other. This is not a unified place. It actually requires a strong imperial fist to get these pieces of China together. Just as an example, before the 20th century, both of the deadliest wars in human history were Chinese civil wars. And so when things break down in China, they get so bad that you really have there's no comparison. Like people in the West, in the United States, like talk about, oh, we have political violence and political chaos and everything is breaking down. It's like, please, child, no, you have no idea how bad it gets. Like, just wait till what's going to happen in China. I mean, that's really where we're headed, because the rise of China, the spectacular, rapid modernization, it came with a lot of costs, and it pushed so many things into such a tight time frame that the final effects of this are almost certainly going to be that the collapse, the fall of China is going to be even more impressive than the rise. And it's just, like they say, the faster you rise, the harder you fall. That's what we're going to see here. And when I say there's many Chinas, these Chinas, they're going to duke it out.
Very interesting there. You talk, so of course, China's ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. China used to be a fully communist state. How's it shifted from communism decades back to where it is now? It's of course modernized massively, and it's now one of the biggest economies in the world.
Yeah, so this is a common question, Jason. How can there be billions of how can there be so many billionaires in China yet it be ruled by a communist party? How can you have dozens of billionaires within the actual legislature of the Communist Party, of communist China? It just doesn't make any sense, right? What's happening here is that our categories are out of date, and they don't really fit. I mean, China is just kind of a, you could call it fascist, you could call it corporate fascist, you could call it imperial, you could call it totalitarian, but the red, I guess you could say the red or the black, that's one way to say fascism, but communism is very useful to understand China. It's interesting to see and to understand how this fit into both ancient Chinese politics and theories of politics, as well as China's integration into the modern world. The Communist Party, developed in the 1920s. It was, founded and helped by the Soviet Union in a lot of ways, and it had an interesting role to play. But to function as a modern economy, to join the modern economy, when Nixon went to China, basically what happened is that China was given, admittance into the American global system, right? And for that to work, to really enter into this system, requires that you adjust to its norms, because you can't have communism and stuff. So, and we could go through all the different parts and sectors of China and stuff, but one way to think about it, great example is the property sector. So technically in China, believe it or not, even today, all land is owned by the Communist Party. But what they did, is particularly in the 90s, is they said, okay, it's all for the Communist Party, but there's a secondary market. So you have use rights. So, okay, it's all, yes, everything all your property is owned by the Communist Party, but you get a use right for all these years. So they basically created an equivalent to a modern, a Western property market, but it's a secondary market because everything is still owned technically by the Communist Party. And there's a lot of ways like this where there is a nominally communist system that has been basically contorted to fit a global sort of capitalist framework. And that's a lot of what happened. But the key thing is in China, it's not really whether it's communist or not. And for anyone interested, really check out, I have this 5-part series called Tales of the Communist Empire. It breaks down a lot of this, actually treating the Communist Party kind of with the historical weight that it deserves, even though you could just say it's a corporate fascist state at this point. It's easier to go through that history, give people an understanding. But I really wouldn't focus on the communism as much anymore. It's very easy for Western companies, particularly countries, particularly Anglo ones like Britain or America, to fixate and get crazy about the communist side of things. But in a lot of ways, it's really just a red veneer at this point for massive wealth expropriation. There's an elite cadre that controls access to resources and talent and data and energy and information and everything. And that is kind of where things have headed. Where things have gone. The Communist Party has so enriched itself during this development of China that it's really broken. In a lot of ways, the communist linkages, just because it's it gets ridiculous, right? You're like, how can you have so many billionaires? And again, it's one of those things where the contradictions can overwhelm us, but it's best to just think, they're just another, authoritarian, totalitarian type state. Honestly, I think the best way to understand China is just think of it as an imperial state. similar to Russia, the same way that Russia invading Ukraine would look very familiar to any old Kaisers or crafty British prime ministers or old Turkish sultans back in the day. They'd be like, "Oh, of course they're going into Ukraine. What do you mean? Why wouldn't they? It's only our modern Western sense of politics that makes it seem confusing." Very similar with China. Think of it as a classic, large, overly large, decadent, collapsing under its own weight sort of empire, and it starts to make a lot more sense.
So that brings us on to our next question. And recently, the heads of MI5 and FBI held a conference in which they talked about the threat that China poses to national security of America and the UK. Does China pose a threat to national security, in your opinion?
Well, definitely more than a lot of other places. But part of the story here is that the populations of Anglo countries, Britain, a lot of countries, but let's just use Britain and the United States, they have really soured on China. And for the last 15, 20 years, there's a strong sense that everyone, the population, the electorate feels like China was allowed to grow, develop into a threat, and the governments weren't doing anything. So in the United States, this really crystallized with the election of Trump in 2016, where there was a major backlash. The anti-China rhetoric played really well, and it really showed that there was a strong anti-China bias and animus in the population at this point. It makes sense that the story of deindustrialization, it's even worse in Britain, and in Britain and the United States, is tied in with the integration of China into this global economic system. It meant hundreds of millions of quasi-free, cheap, forced, even slave labor were integrated to the world system. That really crushed the economic viability of a lot of well-paid labor all across the Midlands and obviously the Rust Belt in the United States. So that's part of the story. So what we're seeing now is, ironically, the governments are acting late in the game, right? And so in general, when you're looking at politics, it's very easy to look at all the different personalities and the shifts. Like, oh my God, a new British prime minister again. Who's it going to be? Who was it 3 years ago and 4 years ago? And in an odd way, none of these people really matter, right? It's just the newest flavor of the month. So we got to look at the deeper patterns here, and in particular with these officials. I know less about the MI5, but for the FBI, they're political officials, but they're generally relatively insulated. There's a deep way, at least in the United States, where the industrial espionage, the foreign infiltration of many American systems, whether it's media, whether it's attempts at the Federal Reserve, whether it's all sorts of places. It's really extensive. The Chinese were really effective at doing all this. There was never the same Cold War mentality of like, we should be fighting this at every turn. There wasn't that same whole unity of government type of perspective on how to deal with it. And so all these governments are getting there late in the game. I just want to put that as a preface, because it's gotten out of hand. What's really happening is that China is being touted as a threat at a moment when it is really most likely about to crumble internally and succumb to its own challenges, because there's so many things going wrong in China right now that the idea that they're going to be able to wage any sort of war far from their borders or do anything like that, when almost certainly the entire economic engine in China would hit a standstill. They would literally run out of energy within a few weeks of trying to wage any sort of major war. And again, we're seeing this now. This was all hypothetical before. It's all, oh my God, energy sources would never be really threatened. That's not how the world works. Meanwhile, pipelines are getting shut down in Europe. It was very different. And the Chinese rapidly had to realize, as the Ukraine conflict expanded and developed, that their entire model of how they thought things might play out, in particular with Taiwan, that all wasn't going to happen, right? Nobody was going to roll over and let it happen. The Taiwanese were definitely going to fight. The United States would get involved. Japan has said it would get involved. Even South Korea has started adopting the American language on this issue because it would be so destabilizing. And of course, trying to conquer Taiwan is even harder in a lot of ways than trying to conquer Ukraine, at least, to try to get that first beachhead. So all really important. So yeah, China is a threat, and it's a threat, but it's not a threat like America or Britain are really talking about, not like these guys are talking about. And a key reason why is really, and part of what's going on here is, at least on the American side, the government is actively trying to galvanize Americans to feel like there's a major competitor to the United States, to try and motivate people to do more, to work harder, to be more unified, right? The United States was in many ways more effective as a nation when it had a country like the Soviet Union that it could compare itself to and just do crazy things. It's like, oh my God, they sent a ball of fruit, a metal fruit into the sky. We need to go to the moon, right? That's the kind of thing, when America is really pushed, it can do some very, very impressive things. So the government is actively looking for that. There's a sense of exhaustion, defeatism, lack of growth, stagflation. All this stuff is coming back again. All these dark sentiments, and a lot of this matters. So the government's really trying to push a narrative that there's a competitor. We have to up our game. We have to do this, and it's in a lot of ways I'm supportive of this, to try and get people to get their thing together, get their stuff together, do more. But the truth is, the United States has been the most powerful country in the world for over 100 years. It's arguably been this way since the 1880s, and every single potential competitor whether it's the Soviet Union, whether it's Nazi Germany, whether it was Japan in the 80s, now whether it was China. China is just, in a lot of ways, China is the last potential competitor to the United States. The global risk board, if you want to think about it like that, of who's going to be the most powerful. Is it going to be the nation in North America? Is it going to be the nation in East Asia? Will it be Britain? Will it be Australia? Which country has the resources, the technical resources, the labor, the natural resources, et cetera, to really claim the quote unquote throne of the this world that we've been given? Well, the answer is really clear. It's definitely North America. I could go into that in a lot of detail, but just history has kind of proven that. And once China collapses, it's going to be over. And a lot of the work I've been doing is trying to tell people, well, why? What went wrong? Where do we go from here? And this is just something that people, more than anything, we need to process this. The United States is the top dog in the world. And I'm not trying to say this as an American trying to make, American exceptionalists, we're so great. I just mean, we have to see that, and we have to understand why. We have to understand really why. One of the biggest problems in the left and the right in the United States right now is that nobody really has a good reason of why. On the right, they'll often say it's because of free enterprise and da-da-da and da-da-da. It's like, okay, but maybe free enterprise is just something that is allowed to happen in North America and not other places. Maybe the causation is switched, or it's more complex in general. On the left, there's similar things you could go through. So this is all a very important topic, but the idea that China is really a threat to conquer, I mean, it depends what you mean again, right? Like the idea that China could ever really threaten, I mean, it just depends what you mean. Are you hollowing out the industry in the United States? In a lot of ways, that was the story of the last 20 years. And that was true. That really did impact a lot of things in the United States, but the United States industrial system is extremely flexible. It's extremely adaptive. And I know that's horrible. A lot of people say, dude, the Rust Belt, and it's true. It was a lot less adaptable and less responsive than people imagined. I think a lot of good labor economics have really proved this at this point. But what we're seeing now is the largest industrial build out in the United States since World War II, because everyone who's no longer investing in Europe, I mean, 1 out of 6 German industrialists and industrial enterprises is deciding to reduce or curtail or stop production because they're not going to have the energy resources to do it. The CEO of Volkswagen has said that the best place to invest in the world, the most strategic place to invest, is the United States. There's problems in China. There's problems in Europe. If you're European, also the whole EU, the way the industrial system, the production system integrated as a result of European consolidation has meant that Eastern Europe is embedded in all these German manufacturing supply chains. They do stuff that you need at a lower cost, price point, right? It's a similar, roughly speaking, to Mexico, in the United States, in North America. That model doesn't work, and the whole German model in general doesn't work anymore because you don't have the benign security environment, you don't have the cheap energy, you don't have the competitive industry, and you don't have the really effective labor force. You have a shrinking labor force in Germany. All these problems, right? And you have competition actually from China in similar categories of tools, and the Chinese don't want to buy as much from you, et cetera, et cetera. It goes on and on. So this breakdown is happening. And what the net result of it is that more industry is moving to the United States than anywhere else because you have the cheapest energy in the world. You have a large internal consumer market. You don't require all these global external supply chains in the same way, especially if you start rebuilding that industrial base. So a lot of companies have made the choice to be that new industrial base. And it's a huge transformation. And what's going to unfortunately happen is a lot of the rest of the world is going to be further hollowed out as a result of production and investment moving to the United States. And in a lot of ways, we go back to 1945. This is kind of where we were. Just think about it. Let's say I was a French industrial business, and Nasif, you were let's say you were an Italian business, and Ben, let's say you were a British business, right? So all of us, we had a choice. Let's say we had access to the American market now. Why would we really invest in our countries, right? There's what we know. It's our language, but it's a smaller market. The United States had just won a global war. It had won, 2 wars on either side of Eurasia at the same time. It had, basically occupied, the two major maritime powers of the world, other maritime ones in a lot of ways. Functionally, Great Britain had been turned into an aircraft carrier, and Japan had been actually nuked and occupied. Why would anyone invest in France? Why would anyone invest? Realistically, you're going to get better returns in the larger market. And so a lot of what this global system that the United States developed since 1945 does is it creates a world where other countries can develop. And a lot of men, you give countries access to the American market, but they don't have to actually be in the United States. So Germans can sell into the United States. Japanese manufacturers can sell into the United States, but they didn't have to actually be there. And this has been breaking down in a lot of ways since the 70s. Japan, Toyota, actually the largest Toyota facilities are in the United States. They're in Kentucky, the largest Toyota factory. And Japan is now so far gone in terms of its industry that it can't even produce a lot of things, especially not at scale anymore. It needs to actually do most of it elsewhere and just take the profits back home. And this created a lot of problems. So you have huge currency problems, all these problems with currencies, and where is it and why, and is it strong and is it weak, and so many things. This wouldn't matter as much if we didn't have this globalized production and all these flows. But we need to create a system where people would invest in their own countries and still, take advantage of a global economy. And that required opening up the American market to the rest of the world. And that's never happened. You look back at history, the country that opens up their markets is the country, typically, like Britain is the best example of this. What you guys would do in history is just pummel a country and then force them to open up their markets and then flood their markets with all your goods and then crush their economy. And that's like a lot of the story of the 19th century and a lot of the breakdown, the wars in 1848, all those revolutions. I mean, this was the new novel British industrial system, the first in the world, just obliterating a lot of the guild work and stuff that you saw in Germany. Anyway, that's part of the story. So the point being that the losers were the ones who open up their markets. That is the story. And so if you listen to Trump's rhetoric and stuff, it's not a lot of, especially on the right and sort of the more nationalist right in the United States, it's not that it was wrong. That is the true pattern of history. It's just that the last 75 years were different. The United States decided to play a different game. And that game was a lot about giving the world the opportunity to develop, because the American system by itself was a behemoth and it would crush all the other ones, right? And a good example of this is in agriculture, where agriculture is the foundation, is the primary sector. Every other, like you have the base of the pyramid, then you have every other system on top. And at the very top, you have new technologies, other technologies. At the very top, you have like digital life in a lot of ways. You still need all those other industrial systems. At the very bottom is agriculture. And agriculture, if the agricultural system shrinks, the entire pyramid shrinks, right? So if you can't feed your people, then everything goes away. So in China, for example, they're going to really struggle to feed people. And we're talking hundreds of millions of people could die, hundreds of millions. And there's nothing you can do about it. There's the entire agricultural export market in the world is a drop in the bucket compared to what 1.4 billion Chinese people need to feed themselves. So this is part of the story. The United States is, again, very different. The natural bounty of North America has made it so where China has, roughly speaking, had a famine every 2 years for 2,000 years. It's gotten worse in the last 500 years because it's overpopulated. The continental United States has never experienced a famine, really ever, minus like some wars. In normal times, never experienced one. And that doesn't seem like it means much when we're talking about politics and industry, whatever, but agriculture is the base of everything. And so what that means in an economic perspective is that if you open up American exports, wheat export, it would just crush France, it would crush Britain. You wouldn't be able to produce anything competitively. And so if you look at the way the world sits, there's always all these carve outs for agriculture. All of Europe, you guys actually China's worse now. China's insane for agriculture. But besides China, the EU, the whole agricultural subsidy system, it's insane. It is crazy. And a lot of it is trying to create a world where every single farmer doesn't get crushed by Midwest wheat, or corn or dairy, where it's more economic, it's cheaper, it's larger scale in the United States. It's really a challenge. And a lot of this plays out in all these other industries. So the net of it is that this whole global system required a cooperative United States to allow all this to happen. And what happened is that as the whole world developed, this became too much to bear. There are all these consequences in the United States. It's like, yes, the great American system's great, but look at all the job losses. Look at all these rusted out cities. Look how horrible all this is. And it became too much. And so what's happening is that this whole system and all the things that made it possible are being unwound. And they're being unwound because they couldn't survive anyway, but they're also being unwound because America is angry and it's lost interest and it feels like it's been used, it's been taken advantage of, et cetera, et cetera. And that is a big problem. And it's a part of the reason why we're seeing, in particular against China, this strong backlash. And particularly like the FBI, you can't be the domestic, roughly speaking, the domestic security type service and just allow rampant infiltration of everything, which is what the Chinese have been doing. So they're pushing back, but again, late to the game, and the story has changed.
Yeah, and Chinese influence is spreading all across the globe. I've seen particularly in places like Zimbabwe and Zambia, at least one of those countries, where China have a massive grip on the economy. But speaking of the economy, just straying away from China there, you talked about the sheer gravity of the American market. And now the UK has left the EU, but still, nonetheless, there's talk in the EU of it being able to rival the US in terms of attracting business and becoming the go-to place in the Western world. Do you think that's feasible, or is it just a fantasy?
It's a total fantasy. It's a total fantasy. I mean, the Britain's best outcome is to get some sort of free trade deal with the United States and try and join in with what the American system can provide. The truth is that the industrial base of Britain is totally gutted. The largest industrial manufacturer in Britain at this point is BAE, the remaining defense contractor. But the largest customer of BAE is the Pentagon. And slyly behind the scenes, even though it's called, I think it was British Aerospace, something originally, BAE is becoming an American company behind the scenes. It's doing that in terms of its profits, portfolio. All this is what's happening because there's not a large enough market in Britain for its own largest industrial company. And this is, again, just the same story. The American military budget is insane. And part of the reason the American military budget is so large is because we were trying to dominate the security policies of all other Western nations. So we would have a big military, so you didn't have one. And that made you dependent on American systems, American tools, et cetera, et cetera. And that was part of the story. But again, people are always saying that, I know it's a little bit of a digression, but it's really worth talking about because it's always so misunderstood. America's $800 million, billion defense budget. You go, look, the next 10 countries are nothing. Why is this? A big reason why is the American military is large, so others don't have to be, right? You don't want Germany actually investing in its military, because when that happens, everybody starts, there tends to be some conflicts that pop up. You don't want Japan actually investing in its military. Well, this was an attempt, another way to try and control local grievances, local politics, to enable a global system that could actually create, that could help fight the Cold War. That was the original reason all this stuff came about. The United States, like we said earlier, was really focused and created a global system because it felt the Soviet Union was such a threat. It had never existed before in history. And, of course, the Soviet Union went away in 91. And what happened is we were just trying to basically create a global vision of prosperity that everyone could take apart. It's very noble and all that, but it just wasn't feasible at the root reason why is resources. Not everybody can have everything. And the key thing for a country like Britain is there was an extremely, extremely lucrative role for London to play in the integration of the EU, in the regulation of a lot of financial flows, the integration with North American flows. Really, roughly speaking, it's more impressive than this. But like the same way that I said, Hong Kong played the interface role between China and the West. You could think of London as playing that role between, Europe and itself, Europe and America, Europe and a lot of old colonial entities. It's an even more impressive role in a lot of ways. But that story is also kind of ending. And in a lot of ways, London is deeply threatened by New York, eating its lunch, basically. And outside of London, I mean, I don't want to get into the whole story, EU, internally EU politics, but it's not quite as pretty. If you go into the rest of Britain, the original industrial power in the world has really deindustrialized. And I'm actually going to do, I'll definitely reach out to you guys, but I'm going to do two live stream specials on Britain, and then I think I actually I did a piece of one on Britain, and then also on London, because these are really key stories to the story of civilization, of industrialization, of what's happened. But what happened is that industrialization as a tool set, which isn't talked about enough, it's a bunch of tools, and it really enables everything. It's better done in Germany than in Britain, but it started in Britain, and it's better done in the United States than in Germany. So this is where things happen. So the idea you're going to get industrial investment in Britain, it's really unlikely. A big reason why is your demography is so compromised at this point. Basically the demography, so the population age, the structure, skill sets, for the scale that a large industrial build out will require, that time is really past. Also, again, the industrial plant, all the facilities, they're extremely old. If we were to go drive out to the old industrial facilities, they're really old in Britain. We all know this, and it's because you were the first to do it. So it's a real challenge, and it's really not true. And I think that any of the last 15 years of British prime ministers have, roughly speaking, been lying to you guys. It's not possible. And again, there's a similar thing going on here, where how do you? And this is common to a lot of the world. It's common to Canada. It's common to all sorts of other European countries. It's like, how does a government or new potential political leaders speak to a population about a fundamentally shrinking pie? That's a lot of the world is not going to go back to how good things were in 2019. This isn't going to be a recession like we've seen before, because this is about the rearranging of the global system entirely. It's not like, obviously you could talk about recession and but this is about a recession fundamentally is an economic dislocation that manifests in all these growth figures and other numbers. And it's about how that readjusts itself, right? So we just look at the 1970s. The 1970s there was a lot of things going on, but it was the transformation of the financial system, the currency system, the global labor and capital flows. The industrial network was kind of creating a lot of this world that we talk about now, that now it's shifting again. So this is much bigger than kind of the story we're being told. And the honest truth about what Britain should expect is to integrate with the United States as much as possible. We're still in the world where the United States is this big dog, and everybody who has the opportunity to should be trying to integrate with it. It has nothing to do. It's not about pride. It's not about this. It's not about anything else. Most countries don't even have this opportunity. There's a very small number of countries, Britain, Canada, Mexico, and those two are already basically in it. Colombia, oddly enough, some Caribbean countries, some Latin American countries, some Western Hemisphere stuff, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, on and off. This is the new global, like the rest of the world is going to kind of be left to its own devices in a lot of ways, because the US can't put out all these fires everywhere. Let's say there was a conflict over Taiwan, right? And then let's just say there happened to be, this is this worry that's been in American security circles since the 1990s. What do we do if dominoes start falling in multiple places at once, right? So it's already fallen, the hammer is struck in Britain. And the three areas of the world we've been waiting to see whether a conflict will break out, roughly speaking: Eastern Europe, Russia is still Russia, right? That didn't change. And then of course the Middle East, as always, it's always ready to blow. It's still ready to blow, and things are getting worse. And then of course East Asia, where Japanese, Koreans, Taiwanese, Vietnamese, and Chinese, these people do not get along at all in any way. None of them with any of them. So the only thing keeping that together is the US military, in the US global system and prosperity and all this kind of stuff that's come with the world we know. So you have potential conflicts on all these regions that the US doesn't have the military capacity anymore, even though the numbers are so big, to deal with all of them at once, even really to deal with one of them at once. Right. So it's a tough situation. And what this kind of unraveling, and the reason the podcast I have is called China Unraveled, it's both, it's explaining kind of what happens, and also, it's saying that things are unraveling. It's a similar thing with the world in general. And there's not much that we can do. So I wanted to expand that back out, and then I'll bring it back to the question about Britain and finances, it's a good thing to have a future. Like the world's going to be pretty dark. I mean, we're talking about, unfortunately, we're being drip fed information, kind of like COVID. You're being drip fed information about what's going on. You're also being drip fed information about what the war in Ukraine really will do. You're also being drip fed information about what the changing politics, changing demography, changing everything means. So I'm trying to kind of give you guys the full picture here, but almost certainly whatever a British prime minister is saying, particularly let's say a politician who's trying to become the next prime minister, they're just they're trying to sell you an optimistic vision of the world. Nobody wants to be the guy who says, don't worry guys, 2019 was the best it's going to be. Let's just kind of chill and cruise our way out of the living world or something. It's like, you can't really sell. We don't know what politics looks like anymore. This is the truth. We don't know what democratic politics looks like. Democratic in terms of any electoral politics, parliamentary, presidential, whatever. We don't know what that looks like when you don't have growth anymore. We don't know what that looks like. There's no model that we have.
It's great because like great points you made there, because Britain used to be this industrial powerhouse, and now it's nowhere near that. But when you mentioned about London there, I know you talked about London's shrinking influence, but what is very important to notice that London is still a world city, and when we had rapid deindustrialization, the places near London, likes of Kent, which had a mine, they're now middle class areas, and the rest of the country, a bit like where me and Nasif live, they're not. We currently live in the most deprived region of England.
Where do you guys live?
We live in the northeast of England, and we have big shipyards and mines, and of course, there's no market for them in the UK.
Yeah. So for any of those, I mean, so a lot of, well, first I'll take the London part. So London, you know about Crossrail, right? You guys know about Crossrail?
Yeah.
So I have a big background in rail systems, particularly the failure of the California rail system, which I know way too much about. But in general, this was really pioneered. Obviously, for 19th century Europe, that's all fine. But in the modern world, Japan really showed what happens when you create the whole that whole high-speed rail system in southern Japan along that very prominent population corridor there. What happens in a lot of ways when you integrate in an urban area with some outlying urban areas through high-speed trains is what often happens is that those other regions become commuter zones for the bigger city. They functionally just expand the city out, and the available labor pool, the labor pool available to businesses just expands to absorb those cities. So what that means is that in Tokyo, there's there are people who just shuttle in from Tokyo like 30 minutes away, and areas that are still that expands what's connected to that major hub. And that's similar to what's happened in London. Those areas around the financial center are getting the benefit of that, because a lot of people, whether in the services industry, professional services, they're servicing some of those, whoever does have big capital, big money, it's expanding what's available. So it's expanding London out, but not all that much. And so I'll give you a good example of this on a super big level in China. China has more high-speed rail than anyone ever needed. And a lot of what they found is they think, we're going to link everything together. They had a lot of political goals and compete with Japan, a lot of things going on while they have this high-speed rail system, passenger system. But part of what they discovered, what the research shows, is that you think that you're expanding the opportunity for all of these cities, right? Because they're integrating hundreds of cities in with this system. What actually happened is there's a dominant city. Let's just say Shanghai. Shanghai would turn you go out 200 miles from Shanghai, would turn all of that into just a commuter zone for Shanghai. And it would actually impair the local indigenous industries, businesses, services, and everything in those areas, and just transform it into a satellite of Shanghai. So these transportation systems are some of the most fundamental structuring mechanisms for urbanization, for business development, labor differentiation, skill development. All of this, transportation is really the fundamental one. And so there's really massive impacts about what happens when transportation systems develop and the different ones. So it's really complex and it's really important. But in Britain, that's kind of why you have that in the South. And also Crossrail too, all this is being abandoned, roughly speaking, because all it is doing is expanding the commuter shed of London in a lot of ways. And it's not really doing what it's expected to do, right? So they're saying, we'll link it up with, there was all these grand plans about how rail would link these cities in Europe. And, so Europe and the United States they always want to imitate China. They want to have this big high-speed rail thing, but it won't produce the outcomes we're looking for. We're in a much different place. You're not going to be able to solve any of these problems with rail developments.
Yeah, and this is the fundamental problem with HS2, and not just the extremely high cost, almost 100 billion.
Yeah, of course, it's insanely expensive.
Yeah, but the whole idea of it, and there's been big pushes in the last decade or so trying to improve the north of England, and so HS2 would connect Leeds, Manchester, Birmingham. But the problem is, it all has the direct transport link, the fastest one, to London. That's just going to move all those workers, all those commuters to London, and that will, of course, help the capital of the UK, but it's not going to help anywhere else.
But that's how it's meant to be. So if we were to look at a map, again, guys, definitely check out some of these live streams. I'm going to really go over this stuff so you can see it. If we look at a map of France or a map of Russia, the way it happens, the way this development happens is the transportation system, you have the central node, which is the political center, and typically the ethnic center. So London, Paris, Moscow, and you have the transportation system radiating out from it. Because originally it was a method of political control and political integration. And now we're at a later stage of development where we're worried about economic development. But that wasn't the original reason it was structured that way. You just go, pull up Google Maps and look at a map of Russia. Everything radiates out of Moscow, everything. And that was intentional, right? The intention was to link everything in with the political center. And we're in a late stage, late capitalism, late everything, late industrial era where we tried to shift these. We're trying to think of these in new ways to promote economic development, broad-based economic development, all that. But the truth is, the true structuring systems that promote broad economic development is geography. So the United States has this broad distributed set of wealth in different, productive regions without this massive infrastructure, right? You have a lot of wealth in Florida, a lot of wealth in Texas, a lot of wealth around Seattle. You have Microsoft, you have Amazon, you have California, obviously, right? You have the Northeast, you have Chicago. These are all regions that are naturally producing their own economic bases with their own independent systems, and then the United States linked it all together. But what you really need to produce that natural dynamism is a certain geographic foundation, and it changes over time. It changes when you have industrial technologies. Suddenly you need coal, suddenly you need iron, and you need new metals, minerals, and that involved a greater set of regions. A lot of countries got lucky to have coal, for example, in Britain, that enabled the industrial development of the country and all that. But it's more complex. And so the potential, this is one of the great fallacies of the Chinese development model. They thought that these transportation technologies would enable them to do certain things that are impossible, right? They would enable them to overcome geography and become something that they aren't. And it's just not possible. I mean, it's not possible with what we have today, and especially just not in a cost-effective way, right? That's why you get these crazy numbers. You're like, all right, we're building a new, HS, whatever. It's like, are you kidding me? That much money? It's like, what? Like what? I mean, how many Heathrows could you build for $100 billion, right? It's like, I don't know. It's crazy. So it is really important stuff that this transportation, I'm going to do a thing. Right now I'm doing sort of an industry week. I'm talking about some of the key industries historically, what they've meant, trying to relate to current politics and what's going on. But some of the key ones, transportation system development, huge one. I mean, I'll also say that historically a big thing in Britain was canals. Canals are very important originally. You go, or even in the United States, Erie Canal, we all had to learn about the Erie Canal. 95% of Americans couldn't tell you why the Erie Canal was actually important. We just know that we were told that it's a thing all the time. And again, I could show you why, and it's very interesting, but always remember that the true structural ground for all of this is geography. And back in the day, countries were worried about integrating into one state. And it's still the case, unfortunately, in Britain. When did the UK become the UK, right? When was that? It's actually what, early 1800s?
It's 1707, but the thing is, hardly anyone knows in this country. It's not really
hardly anyone. Yeah. Well, it's new. The point being, it was new. Like Britain actually has the longest stretch of uninterrupted government rule of any country. But the integration of the different regions of Great Britain, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland, all this, it's still a struggle. And the reason why is because these are different geographic regions. I've been to Scotland. I've been to Edinburgh. It's like the Highlands of Scotland. That's a mean place to try and go, for the English to go pick every person out of the hills, right? Then you have the French always, allying with the Irish to make trouble for the British. I mean, this is a whole story. But the truth is that what we see as integrated nations aren't nearly as integrated as we think. And unfortunately, Britain, one of the not improbable outcomes for Britain, especially if it doesn't try and get in with the United States as soon as possible, is potentially just the breakup of the United Kingdom. I know that's an intense thing to say, but obviously things have been trending in a very difficult direction since Brexit, before Brexit, and there's even more problems waiting in the wings. And it's really a challenge. So what do you do when you have a population who identified themselves with a certain political entity that is now in trouble or that now might be threatened? These are questions that are going to appear all around the world, particularly in the next 10 years. And it's tough. And it's obviously really tough to imagine that a place like Britain, not only could it fall industrially from these amazing heights, but it could even fall politically, right? It already did fall. I mean, the British Empire was probably the greatest empire the world has ever seen. And now it's just, no offense, just a couple islands, right? Compared to what it was. It's all of it is it's very troubling. It's very difficult to process. And we don't have a political system or a media enterprise that is interested in giving people context for this. It's a lot of reason people listen to me. A lot of reasons. I'm trying to give this broader context that we're totally lacking.
Yeah, and I definitely think the next decade or two will come to define Britain for the next 6 decades, say. But yeah, we're approaching the end of the show. As we do every week, we do On This Day in Politics. So we look back over the years, whether it be in the last few years, whether it be in the last few centuries. And Nasif, do you want to tell everyone what On This Day in Politics is?
That's right. I think pertinently, since we've been talking about East Asia, I'd bring up a country in Southeast Asia, that is Malaysia. On this day in politics, back in 2020, former Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak was found guilty of corruption. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison and fined nearly $50 million. Pretty shocking.
Very interesting. Yeah. So thank you, Jason, so much for coming on the show. I'll put some links in the description to your different stuff. Check out his website, his podcast, his YouTube, his live streams, his book, just everything about him. Okay. Thank you to everybody for listening. Until next week, goodbye.